It all started when Richard and I stopped at the beach that first day. Jean-Paul was handsome, with the body of a Greek god, only darker. He was charming, but I didn't notice that his charm was directed solely at me, and I also didn't recognize his slight jabs at Richard. I stupidly blurted out that Richard and I were planning to spend the afternoon on the nudist part of the beach. So it was no surprise that Jean-Paul showed up that day. And I was pleased to think that I had attracted the attention of such a handsome man. He made sure I was watching him as he stood up to take off his shorts. Jean-Paul smiled at me as he sat down on the lounge chair to my left and continued to dominate the conversation. And I let him. I've always been a good girl. In school and college, I took my studies and football seriously, rarely attended parties, and the few parties I attended were ones that my parents would have approved of if they saw me. I was a virgin until my sophomore year of college, losing my virginity to a guy I dated for almost a year. I was heartbroken when we broke up. It wasn't until my senior year that a second guy pulled me into his bed. We only lasted a few months before I realized that I didn't love him, never would, and would only hurt him by delaying the inevitable. 6 months passed after graduation when Richard came into my life. I was so happy when he continued our chaste ship romance, knocking on my parents' door. Both my parents fell in love with Richard. My dad always spoke of him as his son. Richard was the perfect gentleman when we were dating, never pressuring me about sex, allowing me to take my time to understand that he was my future partner before we made love for the first time. And it was love. I will never forget his look as he hovered over me and entered me. This look said, "I love you." The following week, Richard proposed to me, with my father's permission, of course. It was a short engagement, a wonderful wedding and a honeymoon, just like in the movie. Our marriage was just as great, and we were months away from starting a family when I blew it. My reasons for volunteering to help build the clinic were mostly altruistic, but not entirely. 2 middle-aged nurses at work poured poison into my head, telling me how much I missed out on because I was a good girl and didn't experience all the joys of life before settling down. How could you get married so early? Have you ever wondered what it would be like to make love to someone else? These 2 snakes filled my head with doubts, and I was too stupid to understand that they were single, divorced and jealous of my happiness. So I took the opportunity to step away from my life for a few months to make sure that pregnancy at 28 was really what I wanted. I won't embellish or lie, I was attracted to Jean-Paul. He invited us to have dinner with him in the city as a token of gratitude for allowing him to spend the afternoon with us. Richard didn't want to agree, but I agreed without consulting him. At that moment, Richard would have looked foolish if he had refused. We picked Jean-Paul up at his apartment, had dinner in town, and walked down the block to a dance club. That evening, my butt never touched the seat. Both men took turns dancing with me. It was almost a competition to see who could turn me on the most. It was almost midnight when Richard finally said it was time to go back to our room. Jean-Paul made a comment about Richard being a loser at the party. Richard replied, "No, it's just time for me to be alone with my wife so that we can end the evening as a happy married couple should." I think this angered Jean-Paul. He seemed to take it as a challenge. Getting out of the car at his house, he kissed me on the lips. Jean-Paul tried to use his tongue. Fortunately, I kept my lips closed. I think the only reason Richard and I didn't quarrel that evening was because Richard saw that I didn't kiss back. The next morning, Saturday, Richard told me we weren't going to the beach, so we went to the Dutch side of the island and had a nice lunch. That night we stayed home and made love. Richard was leaving on Sunday, and I was glad to spend the last night before our separation in his arms. On Sunday, I kissed Richard goodbye as he dropped me off at Allison's apartment. His last words before getting into his rental car were, "Remember how much I love you, how much I will miss you. Be careful, love." That first week, Jean-Paul showed up at work to say hello and invited me to lunch. We had lunch together, and he dispelled my suspicions by acting like a perfect gentleman. When Allison warned me that day to be careful around Jean-Paul, I brushed off her concerns. "Well, just be careful around Jean-Paul. Don't forget that you're married to a wonderful man." It was probably the worst thing she could have said at that moment in my life. On the first Saturday, the entire staff went out to dinner. Jean-Paul had apparently become friends with one of my colleagues because he showed up and sat at our table, charming everyone except Allison. Jean-Paul persuaded me to return to the same dance club where we spent the evening with Richard. Jean-Paul danced with me for the next 2 hours, practically having sex on the dance floor, only taking breaks to drink something else at our table. All pretensions to gentlemanliness disappeared after the second dance. His tongue found mine. His hands were on my ass or breasts whenever it seemed to him that we might go unnoticed. He took liberties with me that I never allowed Richard in public, and he took me to his apartment and got me. There is no other way to describe it. Jean-Paul used my body, and my body responded to him. That night, I never had time to think about my betrayal. Every time my conscience began to torment me, Jean-Paul read my thoughts. After the first time, we lay together, me in his arms. Just when I was about to say, "I have to go," he turned me over on my stomach and we had sex again. When I woke up, I saw Jean-Paul looking at me. "You woke up." Without another word, he began the third round. We finished and took a shower together, playing with each other until the warm water ran out. Jean-Paul made coffee and cut a baguette for breakfast. He lent me a toothbrush. I wasn't surprised to see that he had a stash of cheap toothbrushes in his drawer. Seeing my expression, he simply gave me his wicked smile. "Hurry up. We're going to the beach. I'll have to stop by and grab a swimsuit." How will I explain last night to Allison? "You don't have to. You won't go home." "What, do you have a collection of bikinis in another drawer?" "No. But you can wear one of my t-shirts until we get to the beach." "You won't need a swimsuit on a nudist beach." "But I never go without underwear, even if it's a thong." Today, everything will change. We actually went to a nudist beach, although not in Oriente. We went to Kupakoi, a beach that Richard and I had been to once before. Jean-Paul seemed to take pleasure in making me feel uncomfortable by pushing the boundaries. He spread our blanket next to a group of young people. I saw how the three of them, from time to time, glanced in my direction, and I went into the surf. Jean-Paul joined me in the water. When we were up to our necks in water, he tried to have sex in the water. For the first time, I refused him. He was unhappy, but resigned himself. I let him put sunblock on me, and it was almost a mistake. I felt a wave of desire. "Let's get back to you." That's what we did, and we did it. This 2 more times before Jean-Paul brought me to my apartment in the evening. Once again, Allison said something wrong. "I thought I told you to be careful with this man. He's going to ruin your life and ruin your marriage." I didn't need a moral lesson. I didn't say a word. I just went into my bedroom and closed the door. Over the next 2 weeks, I went back and forth between my apartment and Jean-Paul's apartment. And all this time, Allison treated me coldly at work. Finally, on Thursday, I had enough. Jean-Paul asked me to move in with him earlier that week, and until now, I was hesitant. "Allison, Glenna is looking for housing. Why don't I move out and give her my own room? Is that okay with you?" Allison breathed a sigh of relief. "It suits me." "When?" "Tomorrow." I spent the evening packing my things and talking to Richard on the phone. His voice sounded lonely, and it was not an easy phone conversation. I couldn't tell if he suspected something, but I tried to reassure him. We even agreed that he would come to us for another long weekend. Richard will check the flights and contact me. Now I had to figure out how to keep Richard away from Marigot, my work, and Allison. The weekend Richard came for was a disaster. Richard was trying too hard, and I wasn't trying at all. As a result, I began to feel sorry for him, which led to my disrespect for him. I was almost relieved when Richard suggested that I not go to the airport to say goodbye. All weekend, my stomach was churning as I tried to hide the betrayal of our marriage. I hailed a taxi and went straight to the apartment I now shared with Jean-Paul. When I entered the apartment, Jean-Paul was already waiting for me. He lifted my skirt, took off my panties, and stuck his finger directly into my vagina. "Did you use condoms all weekend like I told you?" "Yes, Jean-Paul." "Okay, you belong to me." That weekend, the way I treated Richard, the way I disrespected him, denying him full access to my mind and body. All because Jean-Paul demanded it, led to the complete destruction of any self-respect I still had remained. On Monday morning, a card and flowers arrived from Richard. At first I panicked, thinking that Richard knew that I was living with Jean-Paul, but on the envelope I found Allison's handwriting, who was sending a postcard from my old apartment to the new one. Jean-Paul pointedly threw the flowers outside and then laughed as he read Richard's romantic greeting card before throwing it in the bin. On Saturday evening, we went to a club. Jean-Paul always bought drinks and we danced. At some point, his friend appeared and joined us. Simon was a slight Frenchman who worked in the planning department, and I had met him once before when I had lunch with Jean-Paul. Simon asked me to dance. Come on, have fun," Jean-Paul replied when I looked at him. Simon and I danced the first dance. When the second song began, Jean-Paul joined us on the dance floor. They held me between them, danced dirty, rubbed against me. Finally, one of the bouncers came over to separate us. We must have been very relaxed because I saw some horribly indecent behavior on that dance floor. Jean-Paul got angry when the bouncer told us to cool down. "Let's get out of here." When we walked back to the apartment, Simon was still hanging around. Jean-Paul poured us tequila shots as soon as we walked through the door. Jean-Paul and I sat on the sofa. Simon sat at the kitchen table. Jean-Paul pulled off my top. The lights were off, and only the city lights breaking through the shadows made it possible to see anything. Jean-Paul put me on his knees facing him, continued to caress my breasts, then his hands climbed under my skirt. I felt a second pair of hands on my breasts, lips kissing my neck. When I woke up on Sunday morning, Simon was gone. Jean-Paul made coffee and brought me a cup. It was very rare for him to wait on me in bed. Last night was fun. Drink coffee? We're going to the beach. During the week, Simon came 2 more times. On Tuesday of the 3rd week after Richard's visit, I felt strange in the morning and realized that I had missed my period a few weeks ago. I snuck into the clinic's laboratory while the technician was at lunch and took the test myself, which confirmed that I was pregnant. But how? At the time of the child's conception, Richard used condoms, and Jean-Paul was protected. Condoms can break, but then a terrible thought occurred to me. On Wednesday, I placed a sample of his sperm under a microscope as soon as I arrived at the clinic. Jean-Paul's little swimmers swam in the sample. That son of a bitch was lying. He was fertile and, most likely, the father of my child. I ran down the street to his office and ran into him. "I am pregnant." "And what?" "It's yours, son of a bitch. You haven't had surgery, I checked, and you're fertile." "And what?" "Get rid of it. Or better yet, take him and let Richard raise him." "I can't ask Richard to raise your child." "Don't you care about me and our baby?" Shouting these words, I attacked Jean-Paul, striking his chest with my fists. Jean-Paul responded with a hard slap to the face, hard enough to send me flying into my chair. "You are dumb? Did you really think that I cared about you? It gave me pleasure to make a cuckold out of your handsome sailor husband. Now you can go back to America and he can raise my child like a real cuckold. Get your shit out of my apartment and leave me alone." The slap and his words were like a cold shower. Suddenly everything became clear. My life had become a cesspool of immorality. The blinders came off my eyes and I saw what I had become. Am I too late to save my happy life at home? I reached the apartment and collected my things. At the clinic, I asked Joan if I could stay with her for a few days. I said that I was leaving home. Rumors about this spread within hours. Allison came up to me. "Well, did he corrupt you?" "What? Did he sell you to one of the city officials?" "I warned you to stay away from him. He uses women as bribes to get preferential treatment for his projects." "Why didn't you say this?" I warned. "But you didn't want to listen. You were too caught up in your dirty affair to listen. Good luck getting Richard back. I'm sure he knows what you've been doing here. But Richard loves me." I flew home on Saturday, wishing, hoping, and praying that Richard would forgive me so we could rebuild our life and love together. I was sure that I could return him. He really loved me. About 3 weeks after Jane returned home, her mother and father visited me, and it was a somber meeting. Rose and Paul were surprised by my lack of emotion until I stopped holding it in. This was right after Rose asked me, "Isn't there something you two can do to stay together? You were so suitable for each other." I began to choke, but managed to say these words. I also thought that we were suitable for each other. But I heard them having sex, not even half an hour after we parted at the hotel. She practically ran into his apartment, and as I walked up to the door to face them, I heard them. I couldn't have been more wrong about what I heard, and I'm not going to live with a woman who would do this to the man she claims to love. I'm really sorry. After this meeting, calls and messages from Jane stopped. The documents were signed. After 3 months, our marriage became history. I didn't turn into a zombie and drink myself into oblivion every night. It helped that I had friends and family to talk to, and they mostly listened. With some of them, I talked about my desire to somehow make Jean-Paul pay for seducing my wife. It seemed unfair to me that he got away with everything. A few of my friends were interested in my revenge fantasies, offering ideas, but I don't think they took me seriously. My brother realized that this was not just a fantasy, and warned me not to do anything that could land me in a Caribbean prison. Even though my brother advised against revenge, the memory of the dark smile on Jean-Paul's face will not disappear until I do something. It took planning, but after 2 months I was ready to implement my plan. During these 2 months, I radically changed my appearance. Gone was the business-like haircut and clean-shaven face. Now I wore a thick beard, and on the day of departure, I shaved my head. I gained 35 pounds. After changing my sunglasses from round to aviators, I was completely transformed. I took the train to Miami and took a boat to Puerto Rico. So far, so good. I was in the Caribbean without any official record of my time here. Now comes the hard part, renting a sailboat without a credit card. This is where an old friend and a ton of cash came in handy. I had a backup plan, but I kept my fingers crossed that I wouldn't need it. Tony Albero and I served together on the USS Shiloh and have stayed in touch since he returned to his hometown near San Juan. When I knocked on his door, it took him half a minute to recognize me. 10 minutes later, we were already finishing our first beer, and Tony understood why I had come. "You're not gonna kill him, are you?" "I won't be an accomplice to murder, even if that asshole deserves it." I showed Tony the tools of my revenge, and it made him grin. "Okay, I can agree to that. So, do you need a boat big enough to get you to St. Martin, but small enough not to attract too much attention? Tomorrow we will talk to Hector at the pier." Hector was more than willing to lend us one of the sailboats in his care once I showed him $100 bills. Tony and I set sail early Tuesday morning, just before the fishing boats left, sailed all day, and dropped anchor off Grand Case Bay by 2 a.m. At 4 in the morning, I slipped into the water and swam to the shore. When I reached the shore, I jogged the 3.5 miles to the park across from Jean-Paul's apartment and sat down on the same bench I had sat on a few months earlier when I had watched my wife enter the apartment. I decided to take the risk of waiting and watching, hoping he was a creature of habit. At 8 in the morning, a young woman left the apartment. At 8:30, Jean-Paul. I followed him at a safe distance. He entered the building. I checked the sign on the door. It was his work office. I jogged back to Grand Case and swam to our boat. Tony raised the anchor and we spent the day sailing around Tintamari Island. In the evening, we went to Freya's Bay. Tony didn't even lower the anchor. I tumbled over the side with my tools in a waterproof case, and Tony swam out of the bay. At 7:20 in the morning, I returned to the park, and 35 minutes later, the same woman came out of the apartment. I waited 10 minutes, crossed the street, and knocked on his door. Jean-Paul answered the door with a towel wrapped around his waist. I didn't give him time to say anything before I shot him with the stun gun. He, of course, did not have time to recognize me. That was one of the problems. As much as I wanted Jean-Paul to find out who did this to him, I didn't want to go to jail. Maybe someday, after the statute of limitations has passed, I'll let him know, if it still matters by then. I closed the door behind me. While Jean-Paul was incapacitated, I tied him to a chair, forced him to drink a bottle of sedative water, gagged him, and attached the device. But something had to be done about his pride and joy. In the future, he will be able to use what is left of him, but it will be of little use for pleasing the ladies. It's a pity. I wonder if that will wipe the grin off his face. With any luck, It would be several hours before anyone found the bastard. By then, the damage will be completely done. I quickly jogged back to Friars Bay, swam to the boat, and late Thursday evening, Tony and I sailed back to Fajardo Harbor. By Saturday morning, I was home, shaved, and ready to diet. As for Jane's revenge, that won't happen for several reasons. First of all, I know she is suffering. Her parents have lost their son, and she will have to live with the knowledge that it was her fault. Secondly, I know that there is someone else for me, and living well is the best revenge. And someday she will understand what she gave up. Our future, our children, and yes, the love we shared for the first 6 years together. And lastly, not letting her apologize was probably the most disgusting thing I could have done. That's my revenge, if I'm honest with myself. I moved in with my parents and started working at a hospital near their home while my belly grew. My parents forced me to go to a therapist, saying that this was a prerequisite if they would allow me to move in with them and help me take care of the child. It took no more than 6 sessions with a therapist to analyze where everything went wrong. 2 harpies from my old clinic set the stage for this. I was immature and allowed their ridicule to fuel my narcissism, believing that I deserved and should get more out of life. I was scared that I would become a mother and be tied hand and foot. Finally, I was ready to fall in love with a charming seducer who was offering something forbidden. Therapy explained why I did it, helped me understand what I could do in the future if I ever got another chance at love. But it didn't give me what I wanted more than anything, another chance with Richard. Martin was born on September 6th, exactly 1 year after Irma devastated St. Martin. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one. Listening to the next one.